Welcome to my channel. What if your grandfather's old mountain cabin hid something not meant to be found? Hidden rituals, cryptid encounters, and ancient secrets buried in the Rockies. This is the story of my grandfather's cabin had a secret. I was 10 years old when my parents first dropped me off at my grandfather's cabin in the Rockies for the summer. They said it would be good for me, a place to unplug and breathe fresh air. Even at that age, I was skeptical. My grandfather, Jonas Rourke, was a strange man, not unkind, but quiet. He had that mountain man look. Long grizzled beard, flannel shirts year-round, boots that looked like they'd walked through hell and back. But what unsettled me most was his eyes. Piercing blue, always watching, even when he wasn't looking directly at you. The cabin itself was nestled high in the Colorado Rockies, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell reception, and the closest town was an hour's drive, assuming you didn't pop a tire on the rocks. The place had an eerie stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. But I was a kid, and the thought of spending an entire summer exploring the woods beat any summer camp. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. That evening, after a dinner of baked beans and pan-fried trout, Grandfather took out his tobacco pipe and leaned against the porch rail. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat beside him, a comic book in hand, though I was watching him more than reading. "You ever heard a howl that didn't come from any wolf or coyote?" he asked suddenly, not looking at me.
"No," I replia cautiously.
He puffed his pipe, smoke curling into the dusk. "You will." That was all he said. I didn't sleep well that night. The bed creaked with every breath, and the forest outside made sounds I couldn't place. Creaking trees, rustling brush, chirps that abruptly stopped. But it was the howl that truly froze my blood. It came around 2 a.m., long and low, like a wolf, but wrong. It had depth, too much of it, like it came from something with lungs the size of oil drums. The worst part? It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the mountains, as if multiple things were answering it. I shot upright in bed. The window was cracked open for air, and I swear I heard something heavy brushing against the woodpile just outside. Then silence. In the morning, Grandfather was already chopping wood. I told him what I'd heard. He didn't laugh or call me a liar. "You don't sleep with the window open again," was all he said. Over the next week, I tried to get used to cabin life. I chopped wood poorly, helped Grandfather fish, and hiked short trails that always led me back to the clearing. But I always felt watched. Sometimes I'd hear twigs snapping just beyond the tree line. Once, I spotted something dark moving between the trees, tall, lanky, fast. I told myself it was just a deer, but the dreams were worse. Each night, I dreamt I was running, always running, through the woods with something behind me. I could never see it clearly, just shadows and red eyes in the trees. Always chasing, always gaining. Then came the discovery. It was the 12th day, a hot July afternoon. Grandfather was off hunting rabbits, and I was poking around the perimeter of the cabin, bored. That's when I noticed the grass behind the woodpile had grown higher than the rest, like it hadn't been touched in years. Curious, I pulled the logs aside. There was a trapdoor buried beneath them. It looked ancient, its hinges rusted and padlocked shut. I ran to the shed, found bolt cutters, and snapped the lock. Grandfather never said not to go into it, I reasoned. The door groaned as I opened it, revealing a narrow staircase descending into pitch black. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight and started down. The air grew colder with each step, and a wet, earthy smell filled my nostrils. At the bottom was a dirt floor cellar, no more than 15 feet wide. Shelves lined the walls, filled with mason jars of cloudy liquid, old hunting gear, and something that looked like bones. I approached the back wall and noticed carvings. Dozens of them. Symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in a circular pattern. In the center was a rough sketch, burned into the wood with a hot iron. It was humanoid, but twisted. Too tall, spindly limbs, elongated jaws, and sharp, leaf-like protrusions along its back. Above it were the words, "Guardian of the Hollow Pines." I stood frozen. Then I heard it shuffling above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the floorboards. Grandfather was supposed to be out until sundown. I turned off the flashlight, heart thudding, and crept back up the stairs. As I reached the top, the trapdoor slammed shut. From the gap in the boards, I saw long, gnarled fingers curl around the latch. Not human. I didn't scream. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After what felt like hours, the fingers slipped away. I waited another 10 minutes before bursting out, lungs gasping, and ran into the forest. I didn't stop until I reached the creek a mile down. When I returned to the cabin hours later, Grandfather was back. He said nothing. I said nothing. But he knew. He could see it in my eyes. That night, he handed me a rifle. "If it ever comes close again, you shoot. Don't hesitate." The days after that were a blur. The howls came more often, closer each time. Trees were clawed. A deer carcass was left at our doorstep, its insides scooped out like a bowl. Grandfather stopped sleeping. He stood guard at night, whispering to himself in a language I didn't understand. Then came the night the thing came for us. It was just past midnight. Rain fell hard, thunder cracking in the distance. I was dozing on the couch when I heard the window shatter in the kitchen. Grandfather was already up, rifle in hand. I saw it then, just a glimpse. It stood hunched, almost scraping the ceiling, arms dangling past its knees. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its breath steamed in the cold air. Grandfather fired once. The thing screeched, a bone-chilling, ear-splitting wail, and fled into the woods, taking half the window frame with it. He turned to me, eyes grave. "We can't stay." We packed in under 5 minutes. As we drove down the dirt road, branches slammed against the truck like angry hands. I looked back once and saw it standing in the clearing, watching us go. I never went back to that cabin. Grandfather sold it the following year. He said nothing to my parents, nothing to anyone. But he kept that sketch of the creature, folded and tucked into his pocket until the day he died. I'm older now, but I still hear the howls sometimes, when I camp too deep in the Rockies. And when I do, I pack up, douse the fire, and hike out fast, before the guardian of the Hollow Pines remembers me. The nightmares came back when I turned 35. It had been 25 years since that summer at my grandfather's cabin. 25 years since I saw the thing in the trees, the guardian or whatever it was. I thought I'd put it all behind me. Grown-up life has a way of sanding the sharp edges off childhood memories. But some edges stay jagged, especially when they're buried under silence. When Grandfather died, he left me the deed to the cabin. I hadn't even known he still owned it. My parents assumed he'd sold it years ago, like he'd told us. I remembered that look in his eyes the night we fled. Exhausted, broken. He was done with that place. But apparently he couldn't let it go. Neither could I. The dreams started again a month after the funeral. Same forest, same impossible shadow behind the trees. But now it spoke. Not in words, something deeper. It whispered in vibrations, in groans of timber and creaks of rock. It said, "Come back, come back, come back." I tried to ignore it, threw myself into work. But each night I woke soaked in sweat, heart pounding. And each night the message got louder. Eventually I gave in. It was early September when I made the trip back. I told myself it was for closure. One last look at the place that had haunted my dreams. I told no one where I was going. Not even my girlfriend, Rachel. I'd been so detached from her lately, it almost didn't feel like lying. The drive was long, and the last stretch of dirt road hadn't improved over the decades. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. The cabin still stood, though it looked even more skeletal than I remembered. Roof sagging, porch half collapsed, paint stripped down to gray rot. But the air remembered me. The trees stood too still. No wind.
No birds.
Just silence. I stepped out of the truck, boots crunching against the dirt. The moment I crossed the threshold of the clearing, I felt it like a pressure in my chest. Something awake, watching, waiting. I forced myself toward the cabin. Inside, the musty scent of rot and mildew nearly knocked me over. Cobwebs in every corner, mold creeping up the walls. But everything was just how we'd left it. Even the broken window frame from that night still bore claw marks. My heart pounded with every step as I checked the kitchen, then the back room, then the trapdoor. Still there, behind the woodpile. Still locked. Still humming. I didn't open it. Not yet. I needed to understand what grandfather had been doing down there all those years. I remembered the symbols, the jars, the carvings, and the sketch. I found his old journal under a loose floorboard in his bedroom. Wrapped in a wax cloth, bound with leather and twine, crackled as I opened it. Inside were sketches, symbols, translations, dates, some going back to the 1940s. The first entry chilled me. There's something in the hollow pines. My father saw it. So did his father. Keeps the balance. But the balance is tipping. I flipped through pages filled with desperate handwriting. The guardian is not a creature. It is a warning. It appears when something is wrong with the forest. When something comes through. Dreams are its first tool. The mind is softest while sleeping. You can't kill it. You can only appease it. One phrase was underlined 3 times. The cellar is not a cellar. It is a seal. I stared at those words for a long time. What had he sealed? And why had he left it to me? That night I slept in the truck. Rifle in my lap. I kept the headlights on, though it barely cut through the thick blackness pressing in from all sides. The forest didn't sleep. I heard rustling, groaning limbs, the occasional thud like something heavy dropping from a tree. At 3:14 a.m., the howling returned. Louder than I remembered. Closer. I gripped the rifle, heart thudding. I didn't see anything at first, just mist swirling around the edge of the clearing. Then, just as I reached for the door handle, something moved. A figure. No more than a silhouette, but it was tall. Taller than any man. Lean, limbs too long, head cocked like a curious animal. It stood just outside the tree line, watching me. My fingers froze on the handle. The figure stepped backward, into the woods, disappeared. Then the whisper returned. Not in my head this time, audible. In the voice of my grandfather, it said, "You left the seal weak." At dawn, I opened the trapdoor. The cellar hadn't changed much. Damp, cold, reeking of time and rot. But one thing had changed. The circle on the back wall. The carvings had faded, blackened like burned-out wood. And the creature's sketch? Gone. Only ash remained. That's when the trembling started. Low at first, like the rumble of a distant truck. Then louder, deeper. The floor vibrated under my feet. From the center of the dirt floor came a dull crack. Then another. I backed toward the stairs. A hand shot from the dirt. Long, gnarled, clawed. It gripped the edge of the trapdoor. Another followed. Then the head rose, emaciated, jaw unhinged, eyes glowing red-orange like molten coal. It pulled itself from the seal, gasping like it had been buried alive for centuries. I stumbled back, tripping up the steps. Slamming the trapdoor shut, I dragged the woodpile over it and fled the cabin. But I didn't get far. The forest had changed. The trees had moved. The dirt road I came in on was gone. Just more trees. Tall, dark, unfamiliar. I turned in circles, panic rising, phone still useless.
Compass spun wildly.
GPS dead. I was inside something now. A loop. A trap. The whisper came again. Not all doors can be closed once opened. I screamed at the trees. Fired the rifle into the air. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, behind me. I turned and saw nothing. Turned again, still nothing. But the sound kept following. I could feel breath on my neck, but every time I looked, the air was empty. Until I blinked. And it was in front of me. The guardian. Taller than before. Twisted, monstrous, bark like skin rippling. Its mouth hung open in a silent roar. I ran. No plan, just instinct. Branches whipped my face. I don't know how long I sprinted, but I eventually burst into another clearing, smaller, overgrown. And there, in the middle, was an old tree stump with markings on it. A circle, with the same symbol from the cabin, carved deeply into its center. I dropped to my knees, heart pounding, head spinning. Something clicked. The guardian wasn't trying to kill me. It was driving me toward this place. A second seal? I reached out and placed my hand on the symbol. The wind died, the forest groaned, and the ground opened beneath me. I fell into blackness. When I awoke, I was underground in a massive stone chamber, circular, with 8 pillars surrounding a central dais. Each pillar bore carvings, creatures, seals, forests. I could only make out a few. One looked like the guardian. Another looked like something worse. In the center of the room sat a stone book, open, pages etched in some forgotten language. As I approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was my grandfather, but not. He looked younger, healthier, but his eyes empty. He spoke in a voice that echoed across the stone. "You've broken the chain. The seals are falling. You've been chosen to reset them." I stepped back. "What are you talking about? What seals?" He raised a hand, and the chamber filled with visions, blinding flashes of other forests, other guardians, other seals. Some broken, some burning, some devoured. "You inherited more than the cabin," he said. "You inherited the responsibility. The guardian is a symptom. The cause is coming, unless the seals are restored." "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you're the last." "The last what?" But before I could ask, the chamber trembled again. A crack split the stone beneath the dais. Grandfather turned to me, fading like mist. "Seal the door, or the hollow pines will spread." Then he was gone. I woke up in my truck. Sunrise burned red through the trees. Was it a dream? The cabin still stood, the trapdoor still sealed, but the forest, it was still watching. I drove out fast. This time the road was there. The forest let me go, for now. But the message was clear. The hollow pines aren't just a place. They're a threshold, and something is trying to push through. My grandfather spent his life holding it back. Now it's my turn. I don't know where the other seals are yet, but I've started looking, following symbols, following dreams, because the guardian is awake again. And it's not the only thing in the woods anymore. Since that night, I've kept a journal, detailed notes, sketches, maps, trying to make sense of what I'm dealing with. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I don't believe myself. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. The forest isn't just trees. It's a prison, a boundary, and if it breaks, everything changes. The days after I returned to town, I began digging into local legends. I scoured old newspapers, historical records, and the few remaining locals willing to talk. That's when I found references to the hollow pines, mostly vague, hushed whispers of a shadow forest that shifted and swallowed whole campsites, hikers, even townsfolk. A few talked of strange creatures seen at night, tall, spindly beings that vanished if you looked too long. Others spoke of a terrible presence felt deep in the woods, a feeling of being hunted by something ancient and unforgiving. One story stuck with me, about a ranger named Billy Harker who disappeared in the 1960s. Before he vanished, he left a final, frantic note. "The trees breathe at night. The pines whisper in a language I don't understand. The guardian watches. The seals weaken. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold it back. Pray for those who come after." I wondered, had my grandfather known Billy Harker? Had he been one of the those who come after? The hardest part has been convincing Rachel to come with me. She thought it was a wild goose chase or worse, a mental breakdown. But when I showed her the carvings in the journal, the photographs of the cabin cellar, the claw marks on the window frame, she started to listen. Together, we planned a trip back to the Rockies, determined to find more seals and maybe, just maybe, end this nightmare. We arrived on a cold, overcast morning in late October. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches scratching at the sky like desperate fingers. The dirt road was muddy and full of ruts, but the truck handled it better than I expected. The cabin greeted us with its familiar decay. Rachel shivered as she stepped out, glancing warily at the surrounding woods. I handed her the journal. "This is why we're here." She nodded, face pale but resolute. Our first task was to find the next seal. The journal hinted it might be near an old fire lookout tower, several miles north of the cabin. The hike was grueling steep climbs, slippery rocks, and a cold wind that bit through our jackets. Along the way, strange things happened. At one point, Rachel stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I paused. Only the sound of crunching leaves underfoot. "Again," she said. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed between the trees, like someone knocking on hollow wood. We followed the sound to a clearing where a massive tree had fallen, its roots twisted and exposed like the fingers of a corpse. Carved deep into the roots was a symbol, a circle intersected by jagged lines. The same symbol from the cabin. I traced it with my fingers, feeling a strange vibration ripple through the air. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled behind us. We spun around to see a figure emerging from the mist. The Guardian. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, shadowy shapes moved, twisted forms too fast and dark to make out clearly. They surrounded us in seconds. Rachel screamed as one of the creatures lunged. I fired the rifle, but the shot passed through it like smoke. The creatures snarled, their voices a horrible chorus of animal and human. I grabbed Rachel's hand and ran, heart pounding, lungs burning. We darted through the trees, the creatures hot on our heels. Branches slapped our faces, roots tripped us, but we kept going. Finally, we reached the fire lookout tower, a rusted skeleton of metal and wood. We scrambled inside and slammed the door. Breathless, shaking, we looked out from the tower's platform. Below us, the creatures prowled the forest floor, their glowing eyes scanning. The Guardian stood at the center, watching us. Then it spoke, its voice deep and hollow. "You have trespassed. The seals weaken. The hollow pines spread. The boundary must be restored." Rachel looked at me, terrified. "I don't know how," I admitted. The Guardian's eyes locked on mine. "You will learn, or all is lost." We stayed in the tower until dawn. As the first light crept over the mountains, the creatures vanished. The forest was still again, but the feeling of being watched never left. We climbed down, knowing this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, we searched for more seals, following clues in the journal. Each site was more dangerous than the last. We found symbols carved into rocks, buried beneath moss, etched into ancient trees. And each time the creatures appeared, always watching, always waiting. One night, while camping near a river, Rachel dreamt of the Guardian. In her dream, it showed her visions of a dark force trying to break through the seals, a spreading corruption that turned trees into monsters and animals into shadows. When she woke, she told me the Guardian had spoken again. "The balance is fragile. Without the seals, the forest consumes all." We realized the stakes were higher than we thought. This wasn't just about protecting a cabin or a forest. It was about stopping something that could spread beyond the Rockies. As the days grew colder and the nights longer, our supplies dwindled. The forest seemed to resist us, warping the paths, hiding the seals. But we pressed on, because failure was not an option. One evening, we reached the site of the final seal in the journal. It was a cavern, hidden behind a waterfall deep in the mountains. The entrance was marked with the circle and jagged line symbol. Inside, the air was thick and damp. We lit our torches and descended. The cavern walls were covered with ancient carvings depicting battles between shadow creatures and towering guardians. At the center of the cavern was a massive stone altar, covered with moss and roots. As we approached, the ground trembled. The guardian appeared, blocking our path. "You have done well," it said. "But one final trial remains." The cavern grew dark. Shadows twisted and writhed. From the depths, a monstrous form emerged, larger and more terrifying than any we had seen. The source of the corruption. The hollow. Rachel gripped my arm. "We face this together." I nodded. The fight for the forest and perhaps for the world was about to begin. The cavern seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with the stench of decay and ancient power. The hollow loomed ahead, a mass of darkness that pulsed like a living thing. Its many eyes, red, white, and sickly yellow, blinked independently, watching us with cruel intelligence. The guardian stepped forward, a towering figure of bark and bone, its limbs creaking like old wood. Its voice echoed through the cavern. "The hollow is the heart of the corruption, feeds on fear, on death. It was born when the seals weakened. Destroy it, or the forest consumes all." Rachel swallowed hard, gripping the makeshift spear we had crafted from a sharpened branch and a rusted metal spike. I checked my rifle, now loaded with silver-tipped rounds we had fashioned using old coins from the cabin. Neither weapon felt adequate. The battle began without warning. The hollow surged forward, tendrils of shadow whipping toward us. I fired my rifle, the silver rounds singing through the dark mass. The shots made it recoil briefly, but it regenerated instantly, its form shifting like smoke and ash. Rachel lunged with the spear, stabbing at a glowing eye. The creature howled, a sound that chilled my blood and echoed in my bones. We fought with everything we had, dodging and striking, trying to find a weakness. Suddenly, the guardian joined the fray, crashed into the hollow, limbs swinging with terrifying force. The cavern shook with the impact. The hollow screamed in pain, twisting and shrinking under the assault. But it was desperate. It reached out to me with one tendril, cold and slick like tar. I felt it brush against my skin, and a wave of despair crashed over me. Visions flooded my mind. Burning forests, dying animals, endless shadows spreading across the land. I nearly fell to my knees. Rachel grabbed me, pulling me back. The guardian roared, a sound like thunder. It planted its massive hands on the altar and began to chant. The cavern walls glowed with ancient runes. Light streamed from the altar, piercing the darkness. The hollow shrieked and writhed, trying to escape the light, but it was trapped. With a final, terrible scream, it exploded into a burst of shadow and ash. Silence. The cavern was still. The seals were restored. The forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Rachel and I collapsed, exhausted but victorious. The guardian turned to us. "You have done what many could not. The balance is restored, for now." Then, as mysteriously as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. We emerged from the cavern into the dawnlight. The forest was quiet, peaceful, but I knew this peace was fragile. Back at the cabin, I found one last entry in my grandfather's journal. It was a warning. The seals are not permanent. They must be renewed. The guardian will return when the balance shifts. Be ready. I looked at Rachel. We have a responsibility now, not just to this forest, but to all places like it. She nodded. We'll face it together. The hollow pines still stand, silent and watching. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the guardian waits. The days after our victory were a strange blend of relief and unease. The forest seemed lighter, somehow the oppressive weight lifting. Birds returned, their songs filling the air. The wind whispered through the trees with a gentler voice. But beneath that newfound calm, I knew the true war was far from over. We spent the next weeks at the cabin, restoring what we could. The trapdoor sealed once more, the carvings refreshed with the symbols from the journal. Every night, the dreams persisted, less violent now, but still insistent. The guardian came to me in those dreams, a quiet sentinel reminding me of the price we paid. One evening, Rachel found an old photograph tucked between the journal's pages, a black and white image of my grandfather, standing beside a younger man with the same haunting eyes. On the back, in faded handwriting, Billy Harker and I, 1963. Bound by duty. The seals hold, but only just. The realization hit me like a punch. Grandfather wasn't alone. There had been others, guardians before him. And maybe, after me, there would be others still. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind sighed, I sat by the window looking out at the pines. The forest was alive, watching, waiting, and somewhere deep inside, a new chapter was beginning. Because the hollow pines don't just hide secrets. They guard a legacy, a responsibility, a darkness that will never be fully tamed. And as long as the seals hold, the guardian will stand watch. My grandfather's cabin in the Rockies was always a place of mystery, but after the first night I spent there alone, I realized there were secrets far older and darker than I could have imagined. I had arrived just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the sky bleeding reds and purples. The cabin sat on the edge of a dense forest, towering pines casting long shadows that seemed to breathe and shift. The air was crisp and smelled of earth and pine needles. Grandfather had left me the cabin in his will, along with a faded leather journal filled with strange drawings and cryptic notes about the forest, and something he called the Whispering Shadows. I thought it was just old folklore. I was wrong. That first night, I slept uneasily. The wind moaned through the trees, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint voices. Whispers carried on the wind, calling my name in languages I didn't know. When I finally drifted off, the dreams began. I was walking through the forest, but the trees twisted into impossible shapes, their branches reaching out like fingers. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, dark, shifting forms that whispered warnings I couldn't understand. I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps outside. Heart pounding, I crept to the window. In the dim moonlight, I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, covered in shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. I blinked, and it was gone. The next day, I found my grandfather's journal and pored over it. Pages described encounters with shadowy figures in the forest, spirits or cryptids that protected the land, or cursed it. One entry caught my eye. The whispering shadows are the forest's guardians and its curse. They appear when balance is threatened. Respect them or be lost. I felt a chill. Over the next few days, strange things happened. Tools vanished, only to reappear miles away. Faint footprints circled the cabin at night. The forest seemed alive, watching. And always the whispers followed. One evening, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked and rain hammered the roof. I sat by the fireplace, journal in hand, when I heard a soft knock at the door. I hesitated, then opened it. No one was there, but on the porch lay a small wooden carving. A figure wrapped in shadows, eyes glowing faintly. A warning. That night, the whispers turned to voices. Clearer now, pleading, threatening. They spoke of a breach, a tear in the forest's veil. Something ancient was stirring, and it wanted in. I realized the cabin held a secret far darker than I'd imagined. A secret tied to my family, to the forest, to the shadows themselves. And I was now part of it. The night after I found the wooden carving on the porch, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They clawed at the edges of my sanity, weaving through the thin walls of the cabin, rattling the windows, and echoing through my mind. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by restless hours spent staring into the dark forest, waiting for something, anything, to appear. That morning, I decided to explore the woods, hoping to find answers hidden beneath the towering pines. The forest was alive with movement, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, but nothing visible stirred in the daylight. I followed an old trail my grandfather had marked in his journal, leading to a place he called the Hollow Grove. The trees here were gnarled, their bark twisted like writhing hands, and a heavy silence hung in the air. At the center of the grove stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and faded carvings. Symbols of circles and jagged lines, similar to those in the journal and the wooden carving. I knelt by the altar, tracing the symbols with trembling fingers. Suddenly, the air shifted, the shadows deepened. A low hum filled the grove, growing louder until it was a roar inside my head. The whispering shadows had found me. From the darkness, forms began to emerge, tall, thin figures draped in shifting shadows. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes, glowing embers, pierced my soul. One stepped forward, voice like wind through dead leaves. "You carry the bloodline. The veil thins. The breach grows. You must choose." My heart pounded. Choose what? To guard the balance, or let the shadows consume all? I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure reached out, fingers brushing my forehead. Visions exploded behind my eyelids. Forests burning, shadows devouring, worlds collapsing. I fell to my knees, gasping. When I opened my eyes, the figures had vanished. But the warning lingered. Back at the cabin, I pored over the journal, searching for a way to repair the breach. I found an entry my grandfather had marked with urgency. "The breach lies beneath the old chapel ruins. The seals weaken, the shadows hunger. Only the bloodline can mend the veil." The next day, Rachel arrived, my closest friend and the only person I trusted. I showed her the journal, the carvings, the altar, and told her about the whispering shadows. She listened intently, eyes wide but steady. "We'll face this together," she promised. Together, we set out toward the chapel ruins, nestled in a remote valley shrouded by mist. The journey was treacherous, steep cliffs, tangled underbrush, and the ever-present feeling of unseen eyes tracking us. At night, the whispers followed, turning into voices pleading for help and warning of doom. When we finally reached the ruins, the chapel lay in crumbled heaps of stone, swallowed by vines and moss. We found a hidden trapdoor beneath the altar, leading to an underground chamber. Inside, the walls were covered with carvings depicting battles between shadow creatures and guardians, echoes of a war long past. In the center was a cracked stone basin, etched with symbols matching the seals. Rachel and I worked together, following the journal's instructions to restore the seals. We used salt, candles, and blood from a family heirloom dagger my grandfather had left me. As we completed the ritual, the chamber trembled. The whispering shadows appeared again. This time, less menacing, more solemn. "The veil is mended for now," they intoned. "But beware, the shadows never rest." We emerged from the ruins as dawn broke, the mist lifting to reveal a sky brushed with pink and gold. For the first time since arriving, I felt hope. But deep down, I knew the shadows were waiting, watching, and one day the breach might open again. The days after the ritual were a strange mix of calm and tension. The forest around the cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The whispering voices had quieted, but their absence was almost more unsettling than their presence. Rachel and I spent our time repairing the cabin and studying the journal, hoping to understand more about the shadows and the bloodline my grandfather had warned me about. One afternoon, while exploring the woods near the creek, I found something that chilled me to the bone. A small, hollowed-out tree stump, carved with the same symbols we'd seen everywhere, the jagged circles and lines. Inside was a bundle wrapped in worn leather. Carefully, I unwrapped it. Inside lay a collection of strange objects. Feathers black as night, small bones polished smooth, and a faded photograph of a man I recognized immediately, my grandfather. But his eyes, they glowed faintly red in the photograph. Beneath the photo was a note, scrawled in my grandfather's handwriting. "To those who follow, the bloodline is a curse and a blessing. You must walk the shadow path without fear. Trust the whispers. They will guide you when the darkness comes." That night, the whispers returned, not outside, but inside the cabin. I woke to find Rachel standing silently in the corner, eyes glazed and unfocused. She whispered, The shadows. They're coming. We're not ready. The days grew darker. The boundary between the forest and the cabin felt thinner, as if the shadows were pressing closer, waiting to cross. One evening, while gathering firewood, I saw them, figures moving just beyond the trees, tall, thin, with eyes like burning coals. They watched me, unblinking. I raised my hand in greeting, though my heart hammered in my chest. The tallest figure stepped forward and spoke. The bloodline calls. The veil weakens. You must prepare. Rachel and I knew we needed help. We reached out to an old friend of my grandfather's, a local historian named Clara. She had spent decades researching cryptids and legends of the Rockies. Clara listened to our story with a grave expression. She told us about an ancient order, the Veil Keepers, who had sworn to protect the balance between worlds. My grandfather had been one of them, and now it was my turn. Clara brought us books, artifacts, and even a strange amulet said to protect against shadow creatures. She warned us that the breach wasn't just a physical tear but a thinning of the veil between reality and the shadow realm. If the veil failed, the whispering shadows would flood into our world. The tension built. One night, the shadows invaded the cabin. Doors slammed, windows shattered, and the air grew icy cold. Rachel and I stood back to back, holding the amulet and chanting protective prayers Clara had taught us. The shadows lunged, their forms shifting like smoke and mist. The amulet glowed, pushing them back. But we knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Days later, we discovered an old map hidden in the journal. It pointed to a sacred site deep in the mountains, the heart of the Veil's power. We realized that to truly save the forest, and ourselves, we had to journey there. The path was treacherous, narrow ledges, freezing winds, and a silence that pressed in from all sides. At the summit, we found a stone circle, ancient and worn. Rachel and I placed our hands on the stones, feeling a pulse beneath the earth. The whispers returned, clearer now, guiding us. The veil shimmered before us, a thin curtain of shadow and light. With Clara's guidance, we performed the final ritual to strengthen the boundary. The ground trembled, light exploded, and the shadows screamed. When it was over, the veil held strong. But as we descended, I felt a chill. The shadows hadn't disappeared. They had only retreated. The forest's secret was far from over. Returning from the mountain summit, the forest felt different. Still alive but tinged with an unshakable tension. The veil was stronger now, but its presence was like a thin film stretched tight, threatening to tear at any moment. Rachel and I moved carefully, aware that the shadows were watching us more closely than ever. Back at the cabin, Clara helped us set up wards, circles of salt, herbs, and ancient symbols drawn in chalk on the floors and walls. Each night, we held vigil, the amulet glowing softly as we recited prayers to keep the darkness at bay. The whispers never ceased, but they had softened to murmurs, sometimes pleading, sometimes warning. One night, during a fierce thunderstorm, the power flickered out. Lightning illuminated the cabin in strobe flashes, and in those brief moments, I saw figures moving outside. The whispering shadows had come close. Rachel gripped my hand. We both felt the weight of eyes on us, unseen but palpable. The next morning, Clara found signs of a struggle near the forest's edge. Broken branches, deep claw marks gouged into the earth, and strange black feathers scattered like fallen shadows. The shadows were growing bolder. Determined to understand, I pored through my grandfather's journal again. Hidden between the pages was a letter, addressed to me, written in his shaky handwriting. It spoke of a curse tied to our bloodline, a curse that made us targets of the shadows. But it also revealed a hope. The Guardian. The Guardian was a creature of legend, part man, part tree, protector of the forest's balance. Grandfather had believed the Guardian was real, and that it could be summoned in times of great peril. The letter included instructions on how to call the Guardian, but warned the ritual was dangerous and could awaken forces beyond control. Rachel and I debated the risk, but when the shadows began infiltrating the cabin itself, We knew we had no choice. We gathered the necessary items: an ancient staff carved with runes, the silver coins from grandfather's collection, and a piece of the altar stone from the hollow grove. At midnight, we performed the ritual. The cabin filled with a deep, rumbling sound, as if the earth itself was waking. Then, through the window, I saw it. A towering figure made of bark and bone, with glowing eyes like amber fire. The guardian had come. It moved with purpose, stepping into the forest to confront the shadows. Rachel and I followed cautiously, watching as the guardian clashed with the dark forms. Branches snapped and shadows hissed as the battle unfolded beneath the moonlight. After hours, the forest fell silent. The guardian turned to us, its eyes burning bright. "Balance must be kept," it said in a voice like the rustle of leaves. "The shadows are restless, but they will not claim this land while I stand." The presence of the guardian brought a new hope, but also a new burden. We were no longer just inheritors of a cabin and a journal. We were guardians of the forest's fragile balance. And the whispering shadows? They still whispered, always watching, always waiting. The dawn that followed the guardian's arrival was quiet but charged with a strange energy. The forest seemed to breathe a little easier, though the air still hummed with unseen tension. Rachel and I spent the morning repairing the cabin, our hands steady but our minds restless. Grandfather's journal lay open between us. His final entries were both a warning and a blessing. He spoke of the sacrifices made by the veil keepers, the eternal vigilance required to keep the balance, and the price paid by those who bore the bloodline. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, the whispers returned. Not angry this time, but mournful. I stepped outside, the cool air filling my lungs. The shadows gathered at the edge of the forest, forming shapes that shimmered and danced in the fading light. One figure stepped forward, less a threat now, more a messenger. It spoke softly, "You have chosen the path. The veil is held for now. But the shadows are patient. They wait for weakness." Rachel joined me, her hand finding mine. We stood together, watching the shadows fade into the trees. I realized then that the forest's secret was no longer just my grandfather's burden. It was ours. And as long as the whispering shadows whispered in the pines, we would listen. We would guard. We would fight. Because some legacies are too powerful to ignore, and some shadows too persistent to escape. The cabin, the forest, the whispers, they were now a part of me, and I would protect them no matter the cost. My grandfather's cabin sat high in the Rockies, nestled between jagged peaks and endless pine forests. It was a place I'd visited countless times as a child, a sanctuary from the world below. But when I inherited the cabin after his passing, I discovered a secret he had never told me. One that changed everything I thought I knew about him, about the wilderness, and about the creatures that lurk just beyond the trees. It started with the stories. Old-timers in the nearby town spoke of a figure known only as the Mountain Watcher. A cryptid said to roam the high passes, a guardian or a predator depending on who told the tale. They described a towering humanoid, cloaked in fur and shadow, with eyes like burning coals that pierced the darkness. Some said it was a spirit of the mountain. Others claimed it was a lost soul cursed to wander the wild forever. When I found my grandfather's journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the entries spoke of encounters with this watcher. Strange tracks near the cabin, eerie howls echoing through the night, and sightings of a massive figure watching from the ridges. But there was more. My grandfather believed the watcher was protecting something, a secret buried deep in the mountain's heart. On my first night alone at the cabin, I heard the howls. Low and mournful, they rolled over the peaks like a warning. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. In the distance, I saw a flicker of movement, a dark silhouette standing on a ridge, eyes glowing faintly red. The next morning, I found huge footprints in the snow, far larger than any animal native to the Rockies. They led toward a hidden cave entrance, partially concealed by rocks and ice. Inside the cave, the air was cold and damp. The walls bore ancient markings, symbols I recognized from my grandfather's journal. At the center of the cave was a stone altar, worn by time but clearly significant. As I touched the altar, a sudden rumble shook the cavern. From the shadows emerged the mountain watcher itself. Massive and imposing, its fur bristled like the pines, eyes glowing with a fierce intelligence. But instead of attacking, it watched me silently. Over the next days, I observed the watcher from a distance. It seemed to patrol the mountain, guarding the cave and the secrets within. And I realized my grandfather had been part of this strange pact, protecting the mountain's balance alongside the watcher. One evening, as a violent storm approached, the watcher appeared at the cabin doorstep. Communicated without words, gestures and images flooding my mind. A warning. Something was coming. Something that threatened to tear the mountain and the forest apart. I had no choice. I would have to become part of this ancient watch. The mountain watcher was no longer just a legend. It was my legacy. The morning after the watcher's visit to the cabin, the storm had broken with a furious howl, leaving the forest wet and shrouded in mist. I woke to the sharp scent of pine and earth, the air heavy with moisture and something else, something ancient. Grandfather's journal lay open on the table, his notes scribbled hastily about the balance between the natural world and darker forces that threatened it. I decided to follow the watcher's path, hoping to learn more about what it was protecting. The tracks from the cave led me deeper into the mountains, through thick forests and steep cliffs. As I trekked, I noticed signs of a struggle. Broken branches, claw marks gouged into tree trunks, and strange, half-burnt symbols etched into stones. The forest seemed alive, watching. I felt eyes on me, shadows slipping just out of sight. I knew then the threat my grandfather had warned about was real, and coming. That night, I returned to the cabin to find Rachel waiting. She had heard the stories and wanted to help. Together, we pored over the journal, piecing together the tale of the mountain watcher and the cryptids that roamed the Rockies. We learned that long ago, a battle had been fought between the watcher and a pack of dark creatures known as the Night Stalkers, beasts that thrived on fear and chaos. The watcher had sealed them in the mountain's depths, but the seal was weakening. If the Night Stalkers broke free, they would bring terror and destruction to the valley below. Rachel and I made a pact to protect the mountain and its secrets. We set traps and wards around the cabin, using herbs and symbols from the journal. At night, the watcher returned, sometimes watching silently from the tree-line, other times standing guard at the edge of the clearing. One evening, under a full moon, the Night Stalkers came. Shadowy forms with glowing eyes and razor claws, they crept toward the cabin. The air crackled with tension as Rachel and I stood ready. The watcher appeared, its roar shaking the trees. A fierce battle erupted, claws against bark, howls against growls. Rachel and I joined the fight using the wards and rituals we had learned. After hours of struggle, the Night Stalkers retreated into the darkness. The watcher stood tall, wounded but victorious. We knew the battle was only beginning. The mountain held many secrets, and we were now its keepers. In the days following the Night Stalkers' retreat, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. The forest was quiet, too quiet, like the calm before another storm. Rachel and I worked tirelessly, reinforcing our wards and preparing the cabin for whatever was coming next. But the shadows in the woods grew darker, more restless. One evening, while gathering firewood, I noticed a faint glow coming from the cave near the summit. Curiosity overcame caution, and I approached the entrance. Inside, the stone altar pulsed with a strange light. Symbols carved into the rock seemed to shimmer and shift, telling a story of an ancient power hidden beneath the mountain. Suddenly, the air grew thick with cold. The watcher appeared beside me, its massive form both reassuring and terrifying. Spoke, not in words but through images and feelings. A vision of the mountain's heart, a cavern deep below, where the seal holding the Night Stalkers was cracking. If that seal broke, the valley would drown in darkness. Determined to prevent disaster, Rachel and I prepared for a journey into the mountain's depths. Clara, the local historian who had helped us before, gave us talismans for protection and an old map showing hidden tunnels. The entrance was narrow and treacherous, twisting deep into the earth. The air was thick with dampness and the scent of decay. We moved cautiously, aware that unseen eyes tracked our every step. Deeper into the tunnels, strange markings glowed faintly on the walls. We found remnants of battles long past, broken weapons, scorched stones, and bones. The darkness pressed close, but the talismans glowed with a soft light, keeping the worst of it at bay. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the cavern. From the shadows emerged a pack of night stalkers, larger and more feral than before, their eyes burning with malice. A fierce battle erupted in the underground cavern. Rachel and I fought alongside the Watcher, using every skill and talisman at our disposal. The air filled with growls, roars, and the clash of claws against stone. At a critical moment, I noticed a fissure in the cavern floor, a crack where dark energy seeped out. I realized this was the breach the journal had warned about. Using the power of the talismans and my grandfather's dagger, I performed a ritual to seal the fissure. Light burst forth, pushing the night stalkers back into the shadows. Exhausted but victorious, we emerged from the mountain as dawn broke. The valley was safe for now, but the mountain watcher's vigil was eternal, and so was the threat lurking in the shadows. The sun was barely up when we emerged from the mountain's depths, the cold morning air filling our lungs. Rachel and I were bruised and exhausted, but the weight of what we had accomplished settled over us like a heavy cloak. The breach was sealed, for now, but the scars in the earth beneath the mountain remained a stark reminder of the fragile balance we were sworn to protect. Back at the cabin, Clara helped us analyze the ancient markings we had seen in the cavern. She told us the mountain was alive in ways we barely understood, a living entity that held not just secrets but immense power. The Watcher was its guardian, but it was also bound by rules and ancient oaths. "We're dealing with forces older than the Rockies themselves," Clara said, her voice low and serious. "Your grandfather knew this. That's why he was here, why he stayed silent. This is a burden few are prepared to carry." Rachel and I exchanged glances. We had no choice now but to carry that burden ourselves. Days turned into weeks. The Watcher continued its silent patrols, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Strange phenomena began to ripple through the forest. Trees whispering in voices we couldn't quite understand, fleeting shadows that seemed almost sentient, and the persistent feeling that we were being watched by something far older and wiser than ourselves. One night, as a thick fog rolled in, the Watcher led us deep into the forest to a hidden glade we had never seen before. At its center was a massive ancient tree, its bark gnarled and twisted with age. Symbols glowed faintly on its surface, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. The Watcher touched the tree with its massive hand, and suddenly the forest around us shifted. The air thickened, the shadows deepened, and a low hum filled the air. Images flooded my mind, memories not my own, of battles fought long ago, of sacrifices made, and of an ancient pact between the Watcher's kind and the guardians who came before us. Rachel shivered beside me, her eyes wide. "It's alive," she whispered. "Yes," I replied, awestruck, "and we're part of it now." As we left the glade, the Watcher's gaze lingered on us, a silent promise and warning. But the balance was still fragile. The night stalkers were not gone, only pushed back, and the mountain's secrets were far from fully revealed. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences became more frequent. Unnatural howls echoed in the night, shadows flickered in the corner of my vision, and Rachel had nightmares of dark eyes watching from the trees. I knew that the Mountain Watcher's vigil was far from over, and that the true test of our guardianship was still to come. Because some legends are not just stories, they are warnings, and some watchers never rest. The final weeks at the cabin passed in a tense blur. Rachel and I remained vigilant, knowing the night stalkers would strike again. The forest held its breath, shadows lingering just beyond the edge of our sight. The mountain watcher was our silent sentinel, but I could sense its strength waning with each passing day. One evening, under a blood-red moon, the forest erupted into chaos. The night stalkers returned, larger and more ferocious than before. Their snarls echoed through the trees, and the ground trembled beneath their relentless charge. Rachel and I sprang into action, lighting wards and chanting protective spells from Grandfather's journal. The Watcher stood tall, a towering force of nature, roaring a challenge that shook the mountains themselves. The battle was brutal. Claws tore at bark and stone, shadow clashed with light, and the very air seemed charged with raw, primal energy. Amid the chaos, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a burning, searing sensation as if the mountain itself was marking me. Suddenly, memories flooded my mind. Visions of my grandfather standing in this very spot, fighting alongside the Watcher, sacrificing everything to keep the valley safe. Summoning every ounce of strength, I reached for the ancient dagger tucked into my belt. With a prayer to the forest and the Watcher, I plunged it into the ground. A blinding light erupted from the blade, spreading like wildfire through the clearing. The night stalkers shrieked, retreating into the darkness as the mountain seemed to roar in approval. When the light faded, the Watcher knelt beside me, its glowing eyes filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. "You carry the blood of the Guardians," it communicated silently. "The mountain's strength flows within you now." Rachel helped me to my feet, and together we watched as the shadows faded with the dawn. The valley was safe for now, but the mountain had chosen its new guardian, and I was ready to answer the call. The cabin, the forest, the mountain watcher, they were no longer just my grandfather's legacy. They were my destiny. The Rockies are beautiful, but they hold shadows deeper than the valleys between their peaks. My grandfather's cabin was tucked away among the eldritch pines, a name whispered by locals with unease. It was said the pines themselves held echoes, memories or warnings from the past. But I never believed in such things until I spent a night beneath their towering boughs. When I first arrived at the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of resin and moss, the trees whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The cabin was old but sturdy, its timbers darkened by decades of wind and snow. My grandfather had lived there for years, a man of solitude who rarely spoke of the forest's mysteries. But his journal hinted at something else, a secret he guarded with quiet desperation. The first evening was peaceful, the crackling fire filling the room with warmth. But as darkness fell, the pines outside began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that felt like a heartbeat. Curiosity drew me outside, and I wandered among the trees. The forest was alive with strange sounds, whispers in the wind, faint calls that seemed almost human. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet trembled. A shadow passed swiftly between the trunks, too large and fast to be any known animal. I caught a glimpse, something tall, slender, with eyes that glowed faintly green. I stumbled back to the cabin, heart pounding. The journal's pages fluttered in my hands as I searched for answers. My grandfather had written of the Eldritch Pine's guardians, cryptids older than memory, spirits bound to the forest to protect it from unseen threats. That night, the whispers grew louder, forming words I could almost understand. They spoke of a darkness rising from the depths, a force that sought to consume the forest's life. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just a refuge, it was a front line, and I had unwittingly stepped into a battle older than time itself. The echoes of the Eldritch Pines had begun. The night deepened, and with it, the forest around the cabin seemed to breathe in rhythms I couldn't explain. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of twigs was amplified, as if the trees themselves were trying to communicate or warn. I spent hours poring over grandfather's journal by candlelight. His handwriting was shaky but urgent, filled with detailed sketches of strange creatures and cryptic symbols etched into the bark of ancient trees. He wrote of the veil, a fragile boundary between our world and the realm of spirits and beasts, which was thinner here than anywhere else. and he spoke of the echoes, lingering impressions left behind by those creatures, resonances of fear, anger, or protection embedded deep in the pines. According to the journal, the eldritch pines were a gateway, and the cryptid guardians, tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes, were the gatekeepers. Their presence kept malevolent forces from crossing over, but if they were disturbed, the veil could rupture, unleashing horrors that would consume everything. I realized why grandfather had been so secretive. He had lived under constant threat, guarding the cabin and the forest from creatures hungry for the world beyond the trees. That night, as I tried to rest, I was jolted awake by a sharp knock on the cabin door. Heart racing, I peeked outside. There stood a figure cloaked in shadows, face obscured but eyes shining like emerald fires. Without a word, the figure handed me a carved wooden talisman, a symbol I recognized from the journal. It was a sign of protection, a token of the cryptid guardian's trust. Before I could speak, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only the whisper of wind and the faint scent of pine resin. I knew then that I was no longer a visitor. I was part of this hidden world. The echoes of the eldritch pines were calling, and I had to listen. The talisman felt heavy in my hand, its carvings warm to the touch as if alive with an energy beyond understanding. That night, the forest around the cabin thrummed with a power I'd never noticed before, each whisper and rustle more urgent, more purposeful. I spent the next day exploring the edges of the eldritch pines, clutching the talisman tightly. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the subtle changes. Trees with bark that glowed faintly in twilight, moss that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, and the faintest traces of footprints that were far too large and elongated for any known animal. At one point, I stumbled across a circle of ancient stones, half-buried and covered in lichen. Etched into their surfaces were the same cryptic symbols from grandfather's journal and the talisman. The air around the circle was thick and pulsing with an unseen force. Suddenly, the wind picked up, carrying with it a chorus of distant voices, some sorrowful, some warning, some strangely welcoming. It was as if the very forest was alive, speaking to me through echoes of its long and troubled history. That night, the cabin was invaded by dreams, visions of the forest in flames, creatures running in terror, and dark figures slithering beneath the earth. I awoke gasping, my body cold but my mind racing. Rachel arrived the next morning, concern etched across her face. She'd heard the local rumors about the eldritch pines and the strange events happening around my grandfather's cabin. Together, we deciphered more of the journal, uncovering tales of an ancient ritual performed by the cryptid guardians to renew the veil's strength. A ritual that needed to be performed every century to keep the darkness at bay. But the last ritual had failed, the journal warned, and the veil was weakening. Determined to protect the forest and honor my grandfather's legacy, Rachel and I prepared to undertake the ritual, gathering the necessary materials described in the journal: rare herbs, stones, and offerings to the guardians. As dusk fell, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The air was electric, charged with anticipation and ancient power. We stepped into the circle of stones, the talisman glowing softly in my hand. The forest whispered around us, the echoes of the eldritch pines growing louder and clearer. And from the shadows, the cryptid guardians emerged, tall, lithe figures with glowing green eyes, moving silently among the trees. We were no longer alone. The guardians were watching. The cryptid guardians circled us in the ancient stone ring, their eyes gleaming like emerald flames in the twilight. Rachel and I stood at the center, the talisman burning softly in my palm as we prepared to begin the ritual. The forest was alive with a low hum, a pulse that synced with our heartbeat, drawing us deeper into the mysteries of the eldritch pines. Following the instructions in the journal, we arranged the herbs and stones in precise patterns, chanting the incantations passed down through generations. The air thickened, charged with a power so old it felt like the forest itself was awakening. Shadows danced along the edges of the clearing, swirling with intent and purpose. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying a chilling whisper, a warning or a plea, from the depths of the woods. The guardian's eyes flashed bright, and one stepped forward, its slender hand reaching toward the sky. In response, the pines trembled, and from their branches, glowing seeds began to fall like ethereal snow. We caught them in our palms. These luminous orbs pulsed with life, promising renewal and protection. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the talisman's glow intensified, sending waves of light rippling through the stone circle and into the surrounding forest. But as the last seed landed on the altar, a guttural growl echoed through the trees. From the shadows emerged the source of the forest's corruption. A twisted creature of shadow and thorn, the embodiment of the darkness threatening to unravel the veil. Its eyes burned with malice as it lunged toward us, claws ripping through the air. The guardians sprang into action, their forms blurring with supernatural speed as they engaged the beast in a fierce battle that shook the earth. Rachel and I held our ground, reciting the final verses of the ritual as the creature howled in fury. The glowing seeds burst into brilliant light, weaving a web of energy that trapped the shadowy fiend, binding it in chains of radiant pine. With a final roar, the creature dissolved into mist, its hold on the forest broken, at least for now. The guardians turned to us, their eyes filled with gratitude and a solemn promise. The veil would hold, but vigilance was eternal. As the forest quieted, Rachel and I stood together, realizing that we were now part of this ancient covenant. The echoes of the eldritch pines had not only revealed their secrets, they had entrusted us with a sacred duty. The mountain and its cryptids were no longer just stories or legends. They were alive, and so were we. The dawn broke over the eldritch pines with a gentle light, the forest breathing a quiet sigh of relief. Rachel and I sat on the cabin's porch, exhausted but resolute. The ritual had restored the veil, for now, but the weight of the night's battle lingered heavily in our minds. Grandfather's journal lay open between us, its pages filled with stories of guardians past. Men and women who had walked this same path, bound by duty and sacrifice. We were now part of that legacy, protectors of a fragile boundary between worlds. In the days that followed, the forest around the cabin seemed to pulse with renewed life. The whispers turned from warnings to songs of gratitude. The pines shimmered with an ethereal glow at dusk, and the cryptid guardians watched silently from the shadows, their presence both comforting and haunting. But we knew peace was temporary. The forces that sought to tear the veil were patient and relentless. The forest's secrets were deep and ancient, and some shadows were never fully banished. One evening, as twilight faded to night, I found myself alone in the clearing, the talisman warm against my chest. The wind carried a familiar whisper, a reminder of the pact we had made, and the vigilance required to keep it. I closed my eyes, feeling the forest's heartbeat echo within me. The echoes of the eldritch pines were no longer distant legends. They were a call, a summons to protect, to watch, and to fight. And I would answer, because some secrets are worth guarding, because some guardians never rest, because the mountain, the forest, and the cryptids they hid were now part of my story. The echoes would continue, carried on the wind, through the pines, and deep into the night. The timberline was a boundary between the dense forests of the Rockies and the barren alpine tundra above. My grandfather's cabin sat just below that line, where the trees grew thin and the wind whispered secrets through the needles. To the locals, the timberline was a place where the ordinary world faded, and strange things began. When I arrived at the cabin, the mountain air was sharp and cold, the kind that stings your lungs and clears your mind. My grandfather had left it to me, a place he called a sanctuary and a prison. He never spoke much about what lurked beyond the timberline, but his journal hinted at dangers that were not quite natural. Cryptids, spirits, and creatures that thrived in the twilight between worlds. The first night, I heard the calls, low, guttural sounds echoing through the trees, unlike any animal I knew. They stirred something primal inside me, a mixture of fear and fascination. Over the next few days, I explored the rugged landscape, noticing strange markings carved into rocks and trees, symbols that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. I began to understand that the timberline was more than just a geographical boundary. It was a threshold between realities. One evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks, I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, a tall, shadowy silhouette with eyes that gleamed like molten gold. It watched me silently before melting back into the forest. The journal spoke of the Watchers, cryptids who guarded the timberline, creatures born of both earth and spirit. They were protectors but also wardens, enforcing an ancient balance. That night, as I lay awake in the cabin, the shadows outside deepened and shifted. The timberline was alive, watching, waiting, and I was no longer alone. The morning after I saw the shadow at the edge of the timberline, the forest felt different. It wasn't just colder, it was quieter, too quiet. The birds that normally greeted dawn were silent.
No rustling squirrels.
No movement in the brush, just stillness, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I returned to the spot where I had seen the figure. The snow was untouched, except for one long set of narrow, clawed tracks leading deeper into the pines. Too long to be bare, too precise for elk or mountain lion. I followed them for hours. As I moved higher up the slope, the woods grew denser, darker, and unnaturally still. The wind didn't reach this part of the forest. Time felt wrong. I checked my watch 3 times in 30 minutes. Each time, the minute hand hadn't moved. Eventually, the trees gave way to a strange clearing I'd never seen on any map or in any of Grandpa's sketches. At the center was a black, jagged stone half buried in the frozen earth. Around it were bones, some old and moss-covered, others fresh. And carved into the stone, worn but still legible, was a single phrase in Latin, Finis Umbri, the end of shadow. I touched the stone. It was warm, and that's when the forest came alive. The wind screamed through the pines, carrying voices, dozens of them, hundreds, crying, whispering, wailing. I stumbled backward as shadows rose from the trees, curling and stretching into impossible shapes. The ground beneath me shifted, heaved, then opened. I fell, tumbling into cold, echoing black. I woke in the cabin, fire lit, blankets wrapped around me, a tea kettle whistling. Rachel stood over me. "How long have you been here?" she asked. I don't know," I said, groggy. "A few hours? You were gone for 3 days."
Is Certa here?
She handed me a journal, Grandpa's journal, open to a page I hadn't seen before. "If the timberline opens, the hollow comes next." I looked out the window. The forest beyond the tree line was darker now. Something had changed. Something had been awakened. For hours after Rachel told me I'd been gone 3 days, I sat by the fire shivering. Not from the cold, but from the sense that something had attached itself to me. I felt watched. Even inside the cabin, with thick logs between me and the dark, something peered through. Rachel made tea and read from the journal. Her hands shook as she turned the pages. "The hollow is not a place. It's a hunger. It lives beneath the timberline, waiting for a mind to open wide enough to hear it. If the mark is made, if the stone is touched, it begins to feed." I remembered the warmth of the black stone, the Latin words etched into its surface. Finis Umbri. It hadn't been a warning. It had been a seal, and I had broken it. That night the wind didn't howl. It spoke. It whispered my name over and over. Not from one direction, but from all around the cabin. Rachel heard it too. She pretended she didn't. In the early morning, I found deep scratches on the inside of the front door. Long, parallel gouges that hadn't been there before. There was no blood, no sign of forced entry, but the claw marks were fresh, wood splintered at their edges. It was like something had stood just inches from me in the night, separated only by pine and will. Rachel insisted we leave. I told her I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood what I'd released. We trekked back to the clearing, both armed. Her with an old hunting rifle, me with the talisman I'd found hidden under Grandpa's bed. The forest resisted us. Paths we had walked a dozen times twisted. Trees shifted position. The sun refused to break through the cloud cover. Time again broke. My watch ticked backwards. My compass spun uselessly. But eventually the clearing came into view. Except it wasn't empty anymore. Where once the black stone stood alone, there was now a pit at its base. Perfectly round and utterly black, like a tunnel dug straight down into the bowels of the earth. Faint, wet breathing rose from within. The snow around it had melted in a perfect circle. Carved into the stone again, beneath the old words, were fresh marks. Adumbrae redimus. Return to shadow. Rachel turned to run but froze mid-step. Not from fear, from sound. Behind us, from the trees, something massive and low to the ground moved. We didn't see it. We felt it. The vibration in our bones. The cold breath on the back of our necks. Rachel mouthed, "Don't move." But it was too late. The creature stepped into the clearing. 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur that rippled like liquid. Eyes black as coal. Limbs too long, too jointed. His face was all teeth. And it smiled when it saw me. It had waited for someone to open the seal. And now that I had, it would follow me home. The creature didn't charge. It didn't roar or screech. It simply stood there, smiling its impossibly wide grin, as if savoring the moment. Rachel and I froze, the air thick as syrup, hearts hammering in sync with the pulsing sound coming from the pit behind the stone. Like a massive heartbeat echoing from beneath the world. I reached for the talisman around my neck. The second my fingers brushed it, the creature's eyes twitched. Not in fear, not in pain, but recognition. It stepped forward. One long, reverse-jointed leg. Then another. Each movement wrong in its grace, like it was mimicking the act of walking but had never actually done it before. Rachel raised the rifle. "Don't," I whispered. "That thing isn't flesh." She lowered the barrel slowly, trembling. "Then what the hell is it?" I didn't know. But I knew it had followed the crack I'd made in the veil. I'd opened something far older than the guardians of eldritch pines. Something that had slumbered beneath the mountain for generations. The Watchers, the cryptids that had once hovered silently in the forest, had disappeared. Their absence screamed louder than the creature's steps. They had left this place behind, or perhaps had been swallowed by the very thing they were meant to contain. We backed out of the clearing step by careful step. The creature didn't pursue. It simply turned toward the pit and slowly crawled in, folding its impossible limbs like a spider squeezing through a drain. I didn't sleep that night. Back at the cabin, Rachel and I tried to make sense of the journal. Grandpa had written obsessively about the timberline toward the end of his life. One entry stood out, written in shaky ink with smudged corners. The creature does not feed on flesh. It feeds on presence, on attention. If you look long enough, it learns your shape. If you speak its name, it learns your voice. And once it learns you, it follows. Below the entry was a name scratched out again and again, so violently that it had torn through the page. We spent the next 2 days preparing. We sealed the cabin with pine resin and ash, salted every window and threshold, covered the mirrors, burned incense constantly, and still at night I heard the scratching. Not at the door, but in the walls. Rachel started sleep-talking, words in a language I didn't recognize. Her eyes would flutter, and she'd whisper things like, "Beneath the roots," and "The echo is coming." And worst of all, my name, in 2 voices, hers and something else's. I thought about leaving, hiking down the mountain, telling someone, burning the damn cabin to the ground. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Once the shadow beneath the timberline sees you, there's nowhere it won't go. By the 5th night, the cabin was no longer ours. The creature didn't need to knock. It didn't need to break through windows or howl at the doors. It was already here, in the spaces between the wooden beams, in the silence between our words, In the flicker of candlelight when we blinked, Rachel barely spoke. Her eyes were distant, always scanning the corners of the room. When she did speak, it was in riddles. The pine rings are closing, or the hollow breathes when we forget. Sometimes she'd just point at nothing and whisper, "Don't look at it. Please don't look." I tried to ground myself. I reread Grandpa's notes. I made rituals from the scraps of incantations he'd scribbled into margins. Burnt pine pitch, repeated the old Latin phrases, salted everything again. But something had shifted. The creature no longer needed our attention. It had learned us, memorized us, and now it was becoming us. That night, I caught Rachel talking to her reflection. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her lips moving, her voice too soft to hear. The mirror had been covered with an old flannel shirt since our first night, but she'd torn it off. I called out to her. She didn't turn. Only the reflection did. Smiled at me. Not Rachel's smile. The smile. I shattered the mirror. Rachel collapsed. She didn't wake for hours. When she did, her first words were, "It remembers being in the pit." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. We had to finish this. I took Grandpa's journal, a lantern, and the talisman, and told Rachel we were going back to the clearing. She didn't argue. She just nodded, grabbed her coat, and followed. It was snowing. Hard. The sky bruised and heavy. The world around us had warped. The trees too tall, the trails too narrow, the air thick with rot. The forest was wrong now. It was his. At the clearing, the pit was wider. It breathed. Literally. The earth around it expanded and contracted in slow rhythm. A heartbeat in the soil. The black stone was gone. In its place, a mound of fur, bone, and rotted wood. And atop it, the creature, perched like a king on his throne. It opened its arms as we entered, welcoming, mocking. I held out the talisman. It burned cold, ice on my palm. I shouted the Latin words from the journal, over and over. Finus umbri, adumbrae redimus. Finus umbri, adumbrae redimus. The creature tilted its head, amused. Then Rachel stepped forward and began to sing, a song I'd never heard before, a melody raw and ancient. Her voice wavered, cracked, but something in the air responded. The trees bowed inward. The snow stopped falling. The pit screamed. Not the creature, the pit itself. It began to collapse, the edges folding in like burnt paper, the heartbeat fading with each note. The creature lunged. I threw the talisman. It struck its chest. There was no blood, only light. A burst of blinding, blinding light. And then nothing. I woke up in the cabin. Alone. The fire was cold. Rachel was gone. So was the journal. The timberline was quiet. No wind.
No scratching.
Just silence. I searched for her for days. Found no footprints. No broken branches. No signs of struggle. It was as if the forest had simply reclaimed her. Or maybe she was the forest now. Sometimes I hear her voice in the wind, singing that same melody, soft and distant. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see her reflection in windows or pools of water, smiling, watching, waiting. The timberline is still here. The trees still whisper. And beneath the roots, the hollow still breathes. I haven't left. I can't. Because now, I know the truth. The shadow doesn't live beneath the timberline. It is the timberline, and I am its last watcher. Thanks for watching. If you thought the mountains were silent, think again. The secret's out, but the shadows are just getting started. Subscribe for more tales from the edge of reality. Until next time, don't look too long into the woods.